Hello and welcome. If I had £1 for every time somebody has said to me, what do I do with my hands when I'm talking or presenting or pitching, I would be a very, very rich woman. Unfortunately, I haven't received those pounds. What I normally say to people is, well, what do you normally do with your hands? Say you're in the pub with your friends and you're having a drink, or you've gone out for dinner and you're chatting. What do you do with your hands then? And most people say, well, I use them. In fact, I use them too much. I'm always knocking over glasses of water. And I say, then that's what you need to do. When you're presenting, when you're talking, when you're pitching, use your hands in the way that you would if you were talking to your friends and your family. But there seems to be a bit of a glitch in the human brain in that whenever we stand up to speak or present, there seems to be a disconnect between what our brain does, the words we want to say, and then what our hands start doing. So today we're going to talk about what do you do with your hands when you're talking. But before we dive into the what you do with your hands and how you go about gesturing in a way that is going to make you look credible and sound like the expert that you genuinely are even, I want to talk about why it's important. So if we look at something like TED Talks are kind of like the gold standard of thought leadership and communication. If we look at the speeches that go viral, the ones that really get mega attention and really catapult the speaker into the limelight, when we look at how many gestures there are during that 18 minutes of their speech, there's usually, give or take, somewhere around 500 gestures in the 18 minutes that they speak for. For the speeches that are less popular, same TED Talks, same great ideas, same vetting process. But the ones that just don't catch on, the ones that that don't go viral and don't catapult the speaker into the limelight in the same way, have around half the amount of gestures. So somewhere around the 230, 250 mark. So literally half as many gestures. So it's a very interesting correlation between the popularity of the gesturing, so the popularity of the speech and the amount of gesturing that goes on. I'm sure there's other factors at play, but I do think the gesture has a lot to answer for. Now, why is this important? Why does this happen? Well, essentially, when we've got good gesture, and I don't ever really like to say good and bad, but there is definitely good gesture and there is definitely not so good gesture, let's just say that. When we're gesturing in a really cohesive, comprehensive and credible way, it massively impacts how credible we look as a speaker. And if we look more credible, our audience develops a better, stronger relationship with us. They feel they can get to know us, like us and trust us. And then they buy into our idea in an even bigger way. And that means our idea increases in its credibility. So how we present, how we gesture, how we move our hands enables our audience to make a connection between our credibility and the credibility of the idea. It also facilitates their understanding. So good gesture really supports and underlines the message, and it makes it easier for the audience to remember. And the more memorable the message is, the more likely they are to talk about it when they leave the room, the more likely they are to take the action that you're asking them to take. So not only is the idea more credible, but it's got more life. It lives on beyond the point where you finish talking. So what happens if we have not such good gesture, or in some cases, definitively bad gesturing, or none at all? Well, the same thing happens, but in reverse. So let's talk about how your audience reacts to you, first of all. So say I did the rest of this video and I don't move my hands at all. I'm just going to try, it's going to be quite hard, but I'm going to try and not move my arms for the next couple of minutes that I'm speaking and see how you feel about me. Because I can't think and talk if I don't move my hands. I really need to move my hands to be able to talk. So if we don't use gesture in ways that are comprehensible to our audience, it reduces the credibility that we have. So our ideas, our sense or their sense of us as an expert becomes diminished when we stop using gesture or we use it in a way that's ineffective. Our idea is just less memorable. because we're not helping them remember by using the right kind of gesture. It means our ideas don't live on beyond the time that we finish speaking. It means the action that we want our audience or our listeners to take is much less likely to happen. So the very opposite of all the good things that happen when we gesture really, really well, when we gesture poorly, the not so good stuff happens. Our ideas don't live. There's a direct correlation between how expert our audience think we are or perceive that we are, and how much they like or are likely to action our idea. So good gesture is really important to help support your credibility, to support your idea, to support the action that you want your audience to take. I mean, at the end of the day, whenever we're speaking for a purpose. We want something to happen. We never just stand up and speak for no reason. Well, most of us don't anyway. So we want to be able to enable our audience to create a better relationship with the content, or to take action, or create a better relationship with us as the speaker. Those are all perfectly valid reasons for standing up and talking. And our gesture is going to help us do that. So how do we do good gesture? I'm going to dive into that in just one moment. But before I do that, I've got a couple of words of warning. I don't generally like doing this, but I think it's very, very important to point these two things out. So there's two things that I would really advise you against when you're gesturing. So the first thing is repetitive movement. So if I talk for the next moment or two and I just keep doing the same movement, and it has no real bearing on what I'm saying, and it has no real bearing on our relationship or my relationship to the content, but I'm just repeating the same gesture over and over, you start to get distracted by the movement and you stop listening to my words. So repetitive gesture that doesn't support the content is something we really, really want to avoid. So I would ask yourself, have you got a gesture tick? Is there something that you keep doing over and over and over? So maybe this rolling of the hands, that's a very common one. I see that a lot, over and over and over. I see this quite a lot, sort of what I call crab claws, so little pincer movements. So as people are speaking, they're doing this, and it doesn't often make sense with the content. So have you got a gesture tick? If you have, brilliant that you've noticed it, and we want to try to move towards a point where you stop using that repetitively and use it precisely when it's going to make sense. So do you see? Precise, I'm making my finger smaller. So we want to make it make sense to your audience. Now, the second gesture thing that I see, and I see this a lot, is what I call T-Rex arms. So T-Rex arms are basically when we have, so from the armpit to the elbow is essentially clamped to the side of the body, and then all gesture kind of happens from here. So I can only move my forehands and I can only move my hands and wrists. So everything has to happen in this really sort of tiny boxy space right in front of my body. Now, in doing this, it actually raises my shoulders. I look more nervous than I actually am. And most people would do the same thing. So we always want to have our shoulders as far away from our ears as possible. But it means that I can't do anything expansive, and everything looks quite repetitive because I've really only got that lateral movement here and a little bit of up and down, but then I look like a robot. So we want to be avoiding T-Rex arms at all costs. So how do we do that? Basically, we need a bit of space. So between the upper arm and the body, so underneath the armpit, we want some space there. So if you feel your elbows touching your side, you can feel the warmth of your upper arm touching you, we want to try to avoid that. So opening them out, opening your upper arm out from the body, so there's a good distance between the elbow and the side of the body. That's really where you want to be. And that's the most expressive. Your arms and hands can be the most expressive there. They can really support your message. So those are my two words of warning. Try to notice and avoid any repetitive hand movements that you're making over and over that aren't congruent, that don't make sense with the things that you're saying. And the second thing is try to avoid T-Rex arms at all costs. So notice the space, notice the warmth if you've got your arms clamped to your sides. So let's dive into what we need to do to create great gesture. And I am going to start somewhere very counterintuitive. You're going to think that I've lost my mind, but I'm actually going to start with your feet. I know you don't gesture with your feet, and I promise you I'm not mad, but actually how our feet are placed on the floor will have a ripple effect on how we gesture. So if our feet are not firmly planted on the floor, then there is a great chance that we're going to meander. We're going to wander. We're going to walk a bit to the left. We're going to walk back to the middle. Walk a bit to the right. We're going to walk back. Yeah, we're going to wander. Now that wandering does lend itself to repetitive, meaningless gesture. So really, what we want to be aiming for is our feet firmly attached to the floor. So really helping your feet make contact with the floor. It will help you feel calmer. It will help a lot of things that I'm going to talk about in just a second. It will help your body posture and help your breathing. So I'm going to talk about those in a sec. But feet on the floor helps you feel calm, helps you breathe more deeply. Feet on the floor helps you feel grounded and connected to the floor. Now that means you're probably going to be a bit more relaxed. Your brain is going to feel a little bit calmer, and you're going to be able to really consciously decide how to gesture. And it isn't just going to be an unconscious repetition. So how your feet are on the floor genuinely will determine how your body, your breath, and your hands are going to move. So think about that the next time that you're presenting. Now, I'm standing up today. You don't need to be standing up to have really good contact with your feet on the floor. If you're somebody who loves to cross their legs, and I am guilty, whenever you're in a meeting, whenever you need to speak, uncross your legs and put your feet flat on the floor. If you're a little bit shorter, and I know there are some people that have this issue, getting a foot box under your desk is super helpful. So it's like a little step, you can put your feet on it, and it just helps you feel much, much more grounded. So if you've got your feet really well connected with the floor, the next thing we need to think about is your body posture, your alignment. So say that we're standing, as I am today. We always want to have your feet flat on the floor and then your knees over your ankles. So we don't want our knees too locked or too relaxed. Yeah, so they're not hanging over our feet and they're not locked either. So nice and relaxed, knees over ankles over your feet. Moving up, we want the hips over the knees, over the ankles, over the feet. So we've got a nice straight line from the hip down to the ankle. Very important, because that lower base supports the upper body. Now, that means our spines can be nice and straight. So we don't want to be having a collapsed body posture. A collapsed body posture makes it difficult to gesture, and also really lends itself to those T-Rex arms that we want to be trying to avoiding. So we need a nice long spine. So the neck is nice and long, almost like the head is a hot air balloon that's sort of floating away up from the body. So we've got a nice long spine, but not straight. We don't want to look like a soldier on parade. So a nice long spine, but without stiffness in the spine. Now, the reason that we want to do that is two reasons. One, that body posture indicates to your audience that you're calm, collected, organised, and know what you're talking about. The second reason is that if the spine is in a good place and the shoulders are relaxed, you can move your arms. Yeah, I can have that space. I can move my arms. I can gesture in expansive ways. I can gesture in small ways, but I can move my arms in ways that make sense with what I'm talking about. Now, if my posture's collapsed or I'm crushed into a chair, that makes it much, much more difficult. The second reason that this is important is if we've got a nice long spine, I can breathe deeply because my rib cage can move. If I'm crushed into a chair, I've got a collapsed posture, I can't breathe. If I can't breathe, there's no blood, there's no oxygen going to my brain. I'm going to find it very difficult to think, and I'm going to feel anxious as well. Or the likelihood is that our body is going to respond in its automatic way and start producing stress hormones. So the bigger the body, the deeper the breath. So when I say bigger, the more open. I mean, the longer and more open the body is, the deeper the breath, the calmer you're going to feel. And that's when you can decide, this makes sense to gesture here, this makes sense to gesture here. And so it becomes a much more conscious process. Yeah. So we really need to have the feet in a good place. We really need to have a long, aligned body. And that includes when we're sitting down as well. We can't slump in a chair when we're sitting down. So good aligned body. And then a nice, deep, calm breath will allow, one, the audience to see you as an expert, and two, for you to breathe, gesture, and think in ways that are congruent with your content and will help you feel calm, collected, and organised. Now, the next thing I want you to think about is that the space you have around you when you're talking is a little bit like a whiteboard. So if you were talking to a group of people and you had a whiteboard here, you'd have your pen, you'd draw images or words or equations, whatever it is you might, data, whatever it is you might be talking about, graphs, you would draw that on the board. And you would draw it on your board for one reason only, to help your audience understand what it is you're talking about. Gesture is exactly the same. It is to help your audience understand and remember what it is you're talking about. And it also indicates the relationship between you, the content, and the audience. And that's really, really important. We always want to be adapting and changing and moving forward the relationship that you have with the audience as the speaker, and that the listeners, the audience, has with the topic. And gesture is going to help that. It's going to facilitate that, or it's going to undermine it if it's poor gesture. So the good thing about the whiteboard, this idea of the whiteboard and gesture, is, as with a whiteboard, say I've drawn a lovely graph up here on my whiteboard and I'm talking and then I'm going on to another topic and then we come back to the graph. I can just go back to the graph over here and say, well, do you remember when we were talking about this bit here? This was the really important bit, wasn't it? I can go back to it. In the same way, you can go back to an identical gesture later on that makes sense to your audience. So if I wanted to come back and talk about identical gestures later on, I can come over here and you will remember, I promise you, you'll remember that identical gestures lived over here and we talked about it there. So I want you to think about that space as a whiteboard. So if you're talking about multiple different things, you can place things virtually with your hands on your space whiteboard, and your audience will remember when you come back to talk about that gesture over here. Does that make sense? So I want you to think about the space around you as a whiteboard where you can physically place things with your gesture. Now, let's get into the real specifics of gesture. I want to talk about two things. And we're going to talk about circular and linear gesture. There's so many gestures, there's so many specifics we can talk about, there's so many nuances that we could talk about. I could talk about gesture for days, but I'm going to talk about these two things because I think they're kind of fundamental principles that underlie all the other kinds of gesture that we're going to make. So there's two, as I said, circular, I'm going to put circular over here, and linear, I'm going to put over here. So let's talk about those circular gestures first of all. So circular gestures can be literally circular movements. So I might move my hands in this kind of way. They're also open movements. So I might put my hands out towards the sides. My palms are facing up. I'm having to keep this all a little bit smaller to keep everything on the screen at the moment. So my elbows are a little bit too close to my body for my liking, but they're there. So my palms are up and facing forward. You can see my wrists. I've used this gesture moving round and round. I might do this in a more kind of encompassing way. Now, what does that indicate to you? What if I put my hands out here and I say, what does that indicate to you? It's a question. This is what we do when we're asking people questions. Would you like a cup of tea? Do you want Chinese or Indian? Yeah, we ask questions by moving our hands outwards, by showing our palms and saying, this is a discussion. This is you and me. This is me welcoming you into my world. This is you and me against that problem, that issue over there. So all circular gestures are really about opening things out and creating conversation, creating discussion, generating more ideas. So open gestures are really all about that. Linear gestures work in a very different way. So linear gestures are really about action. They're much more decisive, never pointing. That's the other thing that's really important with the linear, never point, because that's accusatory. We want to avoid that at all costs. So nice, open, flat hands, linear gestures, moving away, moving in the direction of action. They indicate this is not a discussion. This is something that is just going to happen. This has been decided and it now needs to be actioned. There's definitely an imbalance of power in a linear gesture, as in this is me telling you this thing needs to be done, rather than it's a, can we do this? Can you see the difference between the two things? I'm going to give you an example in a moment, which will hopefully make it much clearer for you. But linear gestures are much more about things needing to happen. So very different from the circular gestures. So let's take a sentence and let's see if we can really make this live. So shall we say, can you do this? Yeah? So the sentence is, can you do this? Now, if I put my arms out and I open my palms upwards and my wrists are exposed and my body, the visceral bits of my body are exposed, these are the bits that are, potentially puts me in a position where I'm not safe, as in you could attack me and I could be hurt. So from a sort of biological perspective, I'm quite vulnerable with my hands open like this. But if I say, can you do this? It's really a question. It's like, are you okay? Have you got everything you need? Does that make sense to you? Are you happy to do this? Do you feel comfortable doing this? Yeah, this is you and me having a discussion saying, is this going to be okay? Have we got it sorted? Right, brilliant. Now, if I change my gesture and try not to change my tone at all, and I say, can you do this? How does that feel now? When I'm putting my hands forward and it's much more linear, it really sounds much more like, are you going to deliver? Is this going to happen? This is not really a discussion at this point. This is like, you probably better go and do this thing. Yeah, it's got a very different feel to it when I use a straight hand. Yeah, so those two things can really help your audience understand whether this is a discussion, whether this is us solving a problem, whether this is me exploring ideas, wanting you to get involved. It's a much more you and me scenario. Whereas if I'm talking and I need something to get done, then linear gestures are going to be very helpful to my audience. What is extremely confusing for an audience is if you're telling your audience you need something to be actioned, but using a questioning or an open gesture, circular gesture, they're going to go, what do I do? Do I do the thing that you're asking me to do, or do I follow the body language? Now, the chances are they will follow the body language because it's bigger. It's bigger, it's easier to understand, it requires less processing, and it's instantaneous. So you will probably get a mixed reaction in terms of people doing and not doing the thing that you've just asked them to do. If the tone of voice and the gesture are married, they're congruent, they match each other, then you're much more likely to get a higher percentage of people taking the action you want. And equally, if I'm asking a question but I'm doing it with a linear gesture, people might sort of take a step back and kind of go, and then start fretting about giving you the right answer, i.e. the thing that they think you want to hear, rather than giving you their opinion. So we really want to make sure that we're not giving those mixed messages, that what we mean, our intention, is married up with the sentence that we're saying, the content, and with the gesture. So it all makes sense to our audience. So can you see now how when we put all those three things together, your talk, your speech, your pitch becomes so much more memorable and actionable by your audience? And if when we've got those things muddled up, or they're not there, or they're repetitive, or they're a T-Rex, it loses the impact and you lose your credibility. You lose the impetus of your speech. You lose the ability to get people to action on what you're saying. So whether you're in a position of leadership, whether you are not there yet, whether you're moving into those leadership positions, it doesn't really matter, because in every scenario, all of us are selling all the time. Every single day, we're selling ourselves, we're selling our ideas, we're selling our concepts. So those gestures really need to marry up with the content. They need to marry up with our intention in order that we look and sound far more credible than if we don't gesture at all or use poor gesture. And it's always developing the relationship between ourselves, our listeners, the content, and our listeners as well. So we want the gesture to be moving that forward, supporting our ideas and supporting our content. So let's have a quick recap. We really want to be gesturing because there's a direct relationship between how we are perceived, the competence with which we are perceived, and how we gesture. The more gesture we do, the better gesture we do. Not just more of it, but the really good stuff. The more memorable we are likely to be, the more actionable our content becomes. Now, what are the things we need to do to make sure we can gesture in a really comprehensive and comprehensible way? So the first three things we need to do are actually with our body. We need to make sure our feet are really well attached to the floor. If your feet aren't attached to the floor, you're going to wander, you're going to do repetitive gesture that doesn't really make sense with your content. If your feet are nice and attached to the floor, you're going to feel so much calmer, and it means you can align your body so that your hips and knees are over your feet. You can have a nice long spine, a nice open chest and relaxed shoulders, which means you can move your arms freely and expressively. If you're standing well, it means your rib cage is free to move. You haven't got your arms clamped to your side, the rib cage can't move. So if you can move your rib cage, you can breathe deeply. That means you're going to feel calm, you're going to get blood and oxygen to your brain, which means you can be very conscious about using the right kinds of gesture in the right kinds of way. And we talked about the whiteboard. So when we're in that good space, what do we use this space for around us? We place things on our whiteboard that we can come back to and remind our audience of later. So feel free to use that space in front of you. You can do that digitally, as in if you're on Zoom in a virtual world, or you can do it in real life as well. On Zoom, we need to make things a little bit smaller and a little bit closer to our body. When we're in the real world and we have actual human beings around us, we can make things a little bit bigger and we can move things a bit further away from our body. We then talked about two fundamental forms of gesturing: linear and circular. Circular is discussion, it's all about you and me, it's about asking questions, it's about developing the conversation. Linear is decisive, it's about action, and there's an imbalance of power. I have more power than you when I'm using a linear gesture because I'm saying, right, this thing really does need to get done now. So when I'm talking to my son about doing his maths homework, I'm much more likely to use a linear gesture. Jake, it's time to do your maths, rather than, Jake, it's time to do your maths. Yeah, much more linear. Imbalance of power, use it deliberately and sparingly, and when you really, really need that thing to happen. And remember, we want to be avoiding those T-Rex arms. So if you feel your arms clamped to your sides, you can't breathe, your shoulders are up, you look less expressive and more nervous than you probably are feeling. And we want to be avoiding those repetitive, meaningless gestures as we move along. So hopefully today has really helped you understand why gesture is important and the relationship between how your audience see you in terms of your competence and the way that you gesture, as well as your memorability and actionability as well. We know we need to put our body in a good position in order that we can gesture effectively. And to gesture effectively, we can use two fundamental building blocks: circular gestures, when we want to open up the discussion, and linear gestures, when we want to close it down. I hope you have found today useful. I have enjoyed speaking to you as ever. If you'd like to book a coffee chat, please book in the link below. I'd be delighted to talk to you about gesture. Take care, and we will speak very soon.